All right, guys, bang, bang. I'm here with James, who's going to teach us everything we need to know about COVID-19 and potential vaccines and cures. Before we kind of jump into this conversation, I just want to kind of caution everybody. We're recording this remotely. Normally we do everything in person, but given the remote recording, the audio may be a little shaky. So just bear with us if anything happens. But James, thanks so much for joining us on short notice.
Thanks for having me.
Let's start with your background. I kind of want this to be the ultimate explanation of COVID-19 vaccines and cures. But what does your knowledge base come from, or kind of your training that gives you the perspective you have?
Sure. So I guess I really have kind of two backgrounds. So one is in medicine. So I graduated from medical school at Columbia University in New York back in 2014, and then went on to do ophthalmology residency, so residency in eye surgery, and graduated from that in 2018. I also studied epidemiology during medical school, and did some research in that as well, which kind of gave me another perspective, I think, on coronavirus and this pandemic. Parallel to that background, and what most people on Twitter and in this whole universe know me is for cryptocurrency, for Bitcoin. It was in the last year of medical school, so end of 2013, 2014, when that first wave of people kind of got interested in it. It really caught my attention, and within a couple of weeks, it just made sense to me. It was sound money, scarcity, censorship resistance, Swiss bank account in your pocket, all the things that you've said many times. And then I basically divided my time, where half of it was spent in residency, which I was already busy, but I also spent about 30, 40 hours a week studying cryptocurrency, investing in it. And so that worked out very well in 2017, gave me the ability to actually step away from clinical medicine. So in 2018, after I finished residency, I stepped away from clinical medicine entirely to focus on cryptocurrency investments in this space. Ironically, it's cryptocurrency that kind of got me back into the medicine space again now with coronavirus. So I guess quick aside, so Blocktown Capital is kind of what I've been focusing attention on lately. That's our GP only fund. And so that's what we've been publishing research under. But with cryptocurrency, we manage a lot of investments in the space, and it's very volatile, and it's very impacted by world events. And so when I started seeing evidence come out of Wuhan in China of this coronavirus, it really caught my attention. And I was like, is this going to come to Europe and then America? And is it going to wreck the markets and wreak havoc on my investments? And it didn't take long for me to become convinced that there's a really good chance it would, especially when it started to seed in Europe. And then, for the past couple of weeks, it's just been a whirlwind, where I feel like every single day there's a new announcement that is surprising to a lot of people.
Got it. So let's start with kind of COVID-19 or coronavirus. I think everyone at this point has heard about it. Most people are being quarantined or staying at home and staying away from people through social distancing. Give us kind of just a 1 minute, like, what exactly is this, and why is it different than all of the other kind of seasonal things that we would see that are somewhat related?
So I think from a high level, one of the big differences from coronavirus is its mortality rate. That was the big controversy back 3 or 4 weeks, a month ago. At first this is only going to stay in China because it's why would it spread to anywhere else? And so what you have to look at is the R naught. So that means for each person that's infected, how many people will that one person infect? And if it's more than one, and that means this has the potential to turn into an epidemic or pandemic, because now more people are being infected than recovering. Coronavirus did. That's what first caught my attention, which makes it not different from the seasonal flu. Like, that can have an R naught above 1. But then that combined with this mounting evidence, especially with that ER doctor that was kind of the whistleblower on this, when he died, that really got my attention. You can't, that death was prominent. He was a young, supposedly healthy ER doc. So this was more fatal than the seasonal flu. You rarely see people from the seasonal flu that are young die. Maybe sick, and then elderly people, sure. So the R naught is one thing. And to compare this to other historical, because I know, which I got a lot of flack for this early on in Twitter when I kind of started talking about coronavirus in early February. They were like, just talk about Bitcoin, don't talk about this. What do you know about that? And one of the things people kept saying is, how is this different from the flu? This is no different from the flu. And it was that, or I was actually, so not only from the flu, but the second thing I was talking about is people felt like they were being tricked again by the media, in the sense that SARS was supposed to be this big outbreak that didn't really seem to amount to much, Ebola. But the difference is with SARS, which is why I realized early on this wasn't playing out that way, is SARS was not very contagious before you started having symptoms. So it was much easier to, this is longer than a minute, but it was much easier to contain, because once you got sick, you stayed home and then you didn't really infect anyone else. The big difference with COVID-19, novel coronavirus, is that you can be contagious while you're asymptomatic. So you don't know and you're spreading it, and then you get sick a few days later, but you already infected 2, 3, 4 people. So I'd say that's why this is different than, say, Ebola or SARS. And then it also combines that more fatal element than the seasonal flu. Our bodies are not used to this virus, essentially.
Got it. And so before we get into what I'll call kind of the vaccine and cures component of this, a lot of what you just described, your analysis, kind of those original alerts that you saw, red flags, is all about data, right? And one of the questions I think a lot of people have is we've got a pretty good sense of the accuracy of the deaths, right? So the aggregate number of deaths, somebody died, you can test them. Did they have it? Did they not? Maybe before or after death. But the denominator to that mortality rate is how many people actually can, get infected, and then how many people die. There's not a lot of testing that's gone on. So how did you, using that kind of caught your attention in the beginning, some of the red flags you saw, et cetera. I think that there's a lot of confidence in the death number, just given that people are actually dying. It's pretty easy to confirm that. And you can either have test them before or after death to see if they have this. But the actual number of infected, given the low amount of testing that's available, especially in the United States and in parts of Europe early on, how did you think through the accuracy of the data or kind of understand, how bad is this, or could we just be looking at bad data?
So that's a great question. And that's still actually an important question, is how many people are we actually detecting that have coronavirus? That was one of the big problems. It's rolling out this testing to be able to determine that. And so, and even today, a lot of the experts on this, including myself, my opinion is the fatality rate probably is lower than what's coming out of, say, Italy, which is 5% or so. There's a really good chance that people with milder symptoms maybe aren't going into the hospitals to get tested or staying home. And sure, they're bedridden. It could be the worst flu of their life, but they recover. But those would all be people that lived and didn't die. So that still could be the case. I guess one thing, though, that pointed me to, guys, it kind of goes in the other direction of the mortality rate, is because this is a pandemic, the amount of cases was rapidly increasing. So back in January and early February in China, when it was still increasing, you actually had to compare the number of deaths to about the number of cases 10 days ago. Because when you test positive or get it, you don't die. There's a 10-day delay. So looking at that delay when it's rapidly rising in China, it gave me the impression this mortality rate there was actually a fact the other side of this might be higher than those numbers, but then also there were maybe undetected cases. So I kind of balanced that out, and it's, you just have a rough number, but it looked like it was a reasonable fatality rate, far worse than the flu.
Got it. That makes sense. Okay. So now that we understand kind of what this is and the fact that the infection rate and kind of the symptomatic versus asymptomatic are all reasons why this is more concerning, let's walk through why don't we already have either a vaccine or a cure for this? Like what's kind of the scientific explanation behind the lack of that stuff being available today?
Sure. So it's difficult to make a vaccine for a virus that you don't know of. So this is novel coronavirus. It's new. So you wouldn't expect us to have a vaccine for it. What we can do is isolate parts of this virus and then introduce it in cultures and form a weaker version of this virus that we can then give to people. That's essentially what you're doing. When you get a vaccine, you're getting either a dead version of the virus or a weakened version. And so your body, most of the time, you don't even feel anything. Sometimes you feel a little bit under the weather. And so what that does is now you don't really get sick, but now you have immunity to that disease. So that takes knowing the virus, studying it, and then coming up with the vaccine. That realistically, we're not looking to have that until mid 2021. Early 2020 would be a shock if we even are able to successfully come up with one. Regarding a cure for it, viruses are very hard to cure. So coronavirus on a molecular biology level is a single-stranded RNA virus. So what this means is it mutates quite rapidly. So there are times when we can cure viruses. We have cured certain viruses like hepatitis C in the past with medicine, but it's notoriously hard. A lot of times what you can have is find a treatment that can work some part of the time, and kind of flatten the curve in how fatal this virus can be or how much it'll spread.
Got it. And so what is the process? Let's start with maybe the cure first, and then we can go to the vaccine. What's the actual process that people will go through to test and actually validate that, yes, there is something out there that can be a cure?
It's a long process. So you have very early studies in cultures, and then next you have very small trials of 50 patients, and then you kind of keep rolling it up from there. The U.S. is very cautious, very regulated when it comes to studying and approving, the FDA approving of medications, and that has saved the U.S. in the past from certain medications being harmful, like thalidomide is a chemical that's actually very toxic to pregnant women. And so this was rolled out in Europe, but the US said, wait, hold the brakes on that. And that turned out to be a good decision. In the situation of a pandemic, though, it kind of works against us because we don't have 6 months, a year, 18 months to be like, we're going to find a vaccine or a medication to treat this and go through all those proper steps, which we usually do. And so that's where, I've kind of been focusing on a potential treatment that's already widely available, known safety effect profile, and something that about 1 million people or so globally are already on. So if this could actually cure or help reduce the symptoms or reduce the amount of people that get infected with coronavirus, that could be huge. You could expedite those trials and that process much more quickly than developing a whole brand new treatment over the next 6 to 18 months.
Got it. And then is it similar process for the vaccine as it is for the cure? Or is there a completely different process with different timelines and complexities?
I would say a vaccine would even probably take a little bit longer, especially if you because now you're talking about rolling this vaccine out to a large number of people. So if you're going to all of a sudden start making like the flu vaccine where you're recommending just about everyone in America or in the world gets this vaccine, you don't want to mess that up, right? Whereas a treatment, you can be like, okay, well, this person's already sick. We know that there's a 3% mortality rate. We know that this treatment has a very favorable side effect profile, perhaps potentially. And so it's much easier to prove that as opposed to rolling out something that's in healthy people that we don't, the side effect profile has been studied less. Because there's always that concern with the virus. There's always that concern with the vaccine that weakened virus could mutate into a harmful virus, and then you don't want to die from the vaccine.
Got it. And I think that I saw this is like the Imperial College paper that recently came out. Their whole thing was even if you start identifying what you think could be a vaccine, it's got that really long time frame, kind of 12 to 14 months, they said at the earliest, until you could confirm it. And it sounds like a lot of that, similar to what you're saying, revolves around just like you can't go tell people this can save you from COVID-19, but oh, by the way, there's 20% chance it could kill you at the same time. Right, you've got to
for sure. It's
actually safe for the human.
Right. The first three in medicine is do no harm, right? So you don't want to introduce them to something that's going to actually be more harmful to them, just maybe living out the course of the disease.
Got it. Okay. And so talk to us a little bit about the potential cures that you're looking at. I know that there's some encouraging, I think reports and data that is starting to come out now as to how there may be some things that will actually cure this or at least reduce the symptoms.
Yeah. So what I've been focusing on with one of my colleagues is basically it was about 2 weeks ago now. I started seeing evidence coming out in guidelines and from China and South Korea about chloroquine being a potential treatment for coronavirus. And started doing a little bit more digging into that. There was some mechanisms of action that showed how hydroxychloroquine, I'm going to kind of use them interchangeably. They're very similar drugs. I can talk about the differences in a little bit, but it has mechanisms to decrease viral replication in cells and actually eliminate that process entirely, at least in vitro. And they studied this in the SARS version of coronavirus. And so there's already a base of in vitro studies for that. This kind of idea, which wasn't really talked about yet, about chloroquine being a treatment for coronavirus, was kind of justified in my mind when I started to see that the United Kingdom banned export of the active pharmaceutical ingredients in chloroquine. China did similar. They essentially announced in early February, look, the priority, they brought everyone back from the Chinese New Year early and said, hey, look, we need you to produce chloroquine in high volume. We're going to stop all exports of this. And we need to prioritize Wuhan in our own country to make sure that we can stop this. And then in March 9th, I had been in contact with pharmacies. And one of the pharmacists I contacted the manufacturer, Rising Pharma, of chloroquine and announced and told us there's a national shortage of it. And so all these things in my mind was like, basically triggered, there's something big going on behind the scenes. Either they think chloroquine may be an effective treatment or it already potentially is an effective treatment. And so that's when I started talking about it on Twitter and to a lot of colleagues. And this is when one of my colleague on Twitter contacted me and said, hey, I've been studying chloroquine for a number of years. It looks like, I know the mechanism of action behind this very well. I have a paper that I put together. Take a look at it and see what you think. And I looked at it, added some clinical elements to it. I was actually already familiar with chloroquine on a clinical level because one of the main side effects is vision loss. You can have, it's very rare, but you can have vision loss from it. And so I've seen a lot of patients that were on it. And so I was able to add those elements to it and more of a clinical, impression of it. And again, that's because I was an ophthalmologist. So that's why I saw those patients. And we released that paper and it got a ton of attention. It was retweeted by Elon Musk shortly thereafter and just kind of blew up from there. And we were contacted by the press, the media. My co-author, so Greg Regano, has now been on the Laura Ingraham show. He was on Tucker Carlson last night. I think he was on Glenn Beck today as well. And it's, it's starting to become a little bit more justified. So what we had was this kind of summary of all this evidence, I think, to show that chloroquine might be an effective treatment. And then what I announced yesterday, which was we're being in contact with Didier Raoult, this very famous infectious disease doctor, MD, PhD out of France. And he's been studying this for the last few weeks as a treatment for patients with coronavirus. And he had very positive results. It was a small study, just about 36 people that stayed enrolled till the end. But it showed that the combination of hydroxychloroquine plus azithromycin. So again, hydroxychloroquine is like chloroquine. It just actually has a safer side effect profile. So it's kind of used more often than chloroquine. But it showed a very small sample size still, but showed 100% decrease in viral load in 100% of the patients who received both hydroxychloroquine and azithromycin. And so this is a small sample size, but very positive results regarding this treatment method. And this was announced by my co-author on Tucker Carlson last night. And it seems like Donald Trump reacted to that as he, in his press conference today, he specifically talked about anti-malarial medications, hydroxychloroquine, how this needs to be expedited and cut through the red tape if possible to make physicians feel comfortable in using this drug to treat COVID-19 positive patients.
It's pretty crazy that it seems like many of these people are getting their news from television or from Twitter, but it's human nature at this point, right? A lot of this content that gets shared around, that's where people are learning from. Walk us through what is the difference between the hydroxychloroquine, I think is how you say it, and zithromycin. What are those two things kind of at the core, right? And understanding that most of the audience isn't going to be highly scientific, but just how would you describe those?
So hydroxychloroquine is really used mainly as an immunosuppressant. So it's actually used for treatment in patients with rheumatoid arthritis or lupus. It kind of suppresses the immune system in the way to keep the body from attacking itself. It also, again, has antiviral properties and anti-parasitic properties. So it's used as a prophylactic or treatment for malaria. It's very popular in Africa. Azithromycin is typically known as being an antibiotic. Usually prescribed for bacterial infections. But studies have shown that it has antiviral properties. So coronavirus is a virus, it's not a bacteria. So that's a very important difference. That's why they can't give you antibiotics for just a seasonal cold. I mean, you could ask for them. People often ask for them, but it really isn't going to actually help because it's a totally different type of species. But azithromycin actually has antiviral properties in bronchial epithelial cells, and this is where coronavirus will attach, and in fact, is a lot of the respiratory tract. And so azithromycin, it makes sense why it could help treat or be preventative, for coronavirus.
Got it. And then when you talk about those being used in unison, is this actually like a scientific mixture, right? Meaning that you're creating one single solution by combining these two, or is this two separate either shots or however they're actually administered? They're kept separate, but you basically take them at the same time.
Correct. So in the French study, which is really the most data we have at this time on this combination therapy, it's two separate pills. So you take your hydroxychloroquine and then you take your azithromycin. And so what he did for the hydroxychloroquine, it was a 10-day treatment of it at 600 milligrams a day. And then azithromycin was a 500 milligram loading dose the first day, and then 250 milligrams for, I believe, the next 4 days. So oral form, separate pills, but used in tandem combination.
Got it. And so where do we go from here, right? We've identified these two drugs that we think have the potential to be effective in treating this. We've got what I'll call kind of an initial early study that shows some encouraging results. We obviously don't have time to go through kind of the traditional process, but as you mentioned earlier, we want to make sure people are safe and actually can validate the efficacy of this. So like, what does that process look like, or where do we go from here?
So I think what I kind of alluded to earlier, one of the interesting things about hydroxychloroquine is so many people are already on it. So you already have 1 million or so people. So if there is a way to analyze that data that already exists and see if any of those people are getting infected with coronavirus, and as the incidence or prevalence of coronavirus goes up, you should start to see overlap. You should start to see lupus patients or rheumatoid arthritis patients who are on hydroxychloroquine as becoming infected. And so if you were able to create a study that could analyze that group of people, and maybe it's through self-reported or some other means, then that'd be, I think, a safe way to evaluate the efficacy of this drug very quickly, as opposed to doing a controlled trial where you have placebo and all that.
Got it. And so once we get past kind of those studies, so I think of studies maybe correctly or incorrectly as the way to gather data. What are the milestones or kind of the stamps of approval? Like, what does that look like? Is that the people who run the study saying, hey, stamp of approval, this works? Is there some kind of overarching like a governing body or government organization? What does that kind of approval process look like before it can actually start being given to patients kind of on the ground?
Yeah, so there's basically two different ways. So you either have to come to the FDA with sufficient evidence to show that this medication is safe and beneficial in the treatment of a specific disease. That's the, if you want to call it, on-label use. So that's what the prescription is designed for, let's say. Doctors also have the option, though, to use medicines off-label, which means this is not the FDA-approved indication for it, but doctors still have the ability to prescribe medications where they think appropriate or necessary in patients that's not the specific indication that the FDA approves. This is where things get interesting, though, because in America's medicine is fairly litigious. So if you, as a physician, deviate from that standard of care, and then something goes wrong, even if that something went wrong was a small percent, and that could happen to either someone with an FDA-approved indication, it still makes you vulnerable to a lawsuit. And traditionally, it's academic physicians or physicians who are very comfortable experimenting with new use cases for these drugs that will see those patients. The problem we're seeing in a pandemic is those physicians, those academic ones, they're kind of becoming overwhelmed. You have patients all over. So it's not just a very rare case of something where you're looking for a physician that will treat this thing with this off-label use. You have physicians everywhere that are kind of stuck in this thing where, do I use a certain medication off-label to treat all these coronavirus patients that are coming into my ward, or do I just give them IV fluids and hope they get better? And that's, I think, the question that a lot of physicians in the U.S. are dealing with right now. And so they're looking for some guidance from the FDA, essentially saying, hey, look, you can use, which that's kind of what Trump did a little bit today. The FDA, I think, backpedaled on that a little bit, but he essentially said, look, I'm approving physicians to use this medication, hydroxychloroquine, in coronavirus patients. I don't know if it's really that hard of that really passed through. I think that there's still some red tape that maybe needs to go through, but that's essentially, I think, what he's aiming at.
Yeah, it's really interesting to see a lot of kind of the bureaucracies and red tape in the healthcare system being almost broken down in this crisis, right? So everything from what you're talking about, kind of the acceleration or approval process, to the ability for a doctor to actually administer healthcare services to a patient in a different state, right? A lot of telemedicine stuff, et cetera. For those that aren't aware of how bureaucratic healthcare is, there's a lot of rules that I think you kind of mentioned earlier make sense sometimes, and other times they seem really stupid, right? And so it takes a crisis like this to kind of break some of those down, and then maybe some of them get reinstated later, or maybe they don't. But it's just been fascinating to me to kind of watch this almost tennis match between, here's the rules today, well, should we keep them, or is this kind of an emergency situation, let's get rid of them?
Yeah, exactly. You kind of take a hard look and say, wait, which of these rules are actually high yield, and which ones are just vestiges of old bureaucracy that is maybe due to lobbyists, or who knows.
For sure. And so to finish up here, obviously you've got kind of two parts of your brain right now I almost think of, right? You've got the medical side and the training that you've done there, and obviously the hours and hours that you've spent kind of looking at this and starting to identify some of the potential solutions. But then you also are an investor, and you're managing capital and things like that. Where's the crossover in terms of how do you see coronavirus and the economic impact kind of continuing over across different markets in the coming weeks and months?
Yeah, so it's constantly changing, but I think you have to kind of look out for three different potential paths coming up over the next few months or years. So there's the first path where we do find a medication, a treatment, or a prophylactic that can flatten the curve, reduce the symptoms, reduce the fatality rate, or reduce the number of people that get infected. And that could buy us time until maybe a vaccine's developed, or even until we have herd immunity and this thing in coronavirus just becomes almost like the flora of the seasonal flu and not really a big deal. The second path is the virus mutates a little bit. So almost like H1N1, where it was kind of thought of as a big deal, a higher fatality rate. And then it kind of mutated in a way where a lot of people got it. So it's affected a lot of people, but the mortality was actually quite low. So that's why it didn't really even hit the radar all that much. And most people don't know how many people are actually infected by it. And then the third path would be if the virus does not mutate, if we do not have a medication or vaccine for it, then that's scarier, obviously. And what I think you could be looking at is maybe, and this is based off China and South Korea, how their cases have stabilized. Their number of new cases is dramatically dropping. That is this have to do with the warmer weather coming in? And are we going to see a second wave come the fall? And that's what a lot of people compare this to the Spanish flu of 1918, where it had its first wave that kind of ended around June, July. And it wasn't until about October, November, the second wave came in. And that's the one that really wiped out a lot of people. And so that's something that you're going to be looking out for is if this does settle down, that's great. That's fantastic. But keeping a close eye for reinfections in areas come the fall. On a short-term basis, for Americans, look at Italy. We're running about 10 days behind Italy. So what Italy is going through now will be America most likely in 10 days. And this just seems so obvious to me over the past couple of weeks. And so that's why it was interesting. A couple of weeks ago, almost no one was really talking about it. It was almost like a joke. and it was awkward if you weren't shake someone's hand or something. Now it's not. If you actually just look at those stories coming out of Italy about the people living there, what that life is like, prepare for that, because that could easily be America in 10 days. And I think it's already getting very close to that. And so looking for stabilization of coronavirus, again, look at Italy. When those cases stop going up and stabilize, I think that's good news. And I think that there's hope for this stabilizing, at least over the summer, and then we'll have to revisit it in the fall. And then I think the market, so Bitcoin, cryptocurrency, I think that all kind of goes in something this massive. It seems like it kind of is trading along with it. When the economy is going down, it's a risk-on asset, and it goes down as well.
Yeah, one of the things that I've heard, and I don't know if it's true or not, is that once you get coronavirus, you basically can't get reinfected, right? So the population itself, some portion could get infected, it goes away and comes back and could reinfect other people. But is it true that the individual itself, once you have it, you can't get it again? Or is it just too early to know whether that's accurate or not?
So that's typically how viruses work. Once you get a viral infection, you can't get that really exact same viral infection. There can be different strains of it, though. That's why you can get the flu in multiple years. It's not like you get the flu once and you never get the flu again. Another strain can come out the next year, or you might get infected with a different strain even that year. They are finding, though, that they are patients that test negative after they've been treated later than test positive again for the virus. And so that's concerning in some ways, in the thought that, are they not treating patients long enough? Is this some type of reinfection? And so that data is being studied now. But I'm inclined to think that's how you get herd immunity, is potentially if you get infected, you won't get it again. So that's kind of the hope, but it's not definitive at this point.
Got it. And those different strains, I think the other thing I've heard is basically when the warm weather comes, it may kind of migrate south to South America, Latin America, et cetera. But there could be mutations. And then when the cold weather returns later this year, North America, for example, that's where really there could be some problems, because now you're not just talking about the coronavirus, but there could be multiple strains of this or kind of mutations that even if you already had it, you're still susceptible to the new stuff.
Yeah, exactly. I think that one thing that people argue that for going away during the summer is increased temperature will dry out the virus in some ways, and then also the increased humidity. So it's kind of like you have this heat kind of sun drying effect. But then you also have the humidity in the air, which will stop the spread of the virus, because if there's enough water particles in the air, it'll stop the viral particles from kind of projecting when you talk or sneeze or cough.
Got it. No, it's super interesting. Okay. And then what do you think is kind of if you had to guess right now, what does this look like over the next kind of 6 to 8 weeks? Do we flatten the curve, 2 weeks from now and kind of start moving back towards, everyday life? Do we stay in kind of this self-quarantined, even in some places shelter in place for weeks, months? Like, how do you think this plays out given the information you have today?
You're going to be quarantined for at least weeks. I would say at least a month. It could be a couple months, 3 months. It kind of depends on this thesis on this thing slowing down for the summer. But I think we're in for a rocky few weeks coming up. And it looked like Italy was stabilizing a little bit, but then they recorded a record number of new cases yesterday and another record number, it looks like, today. So we haven't had any, there's been no evidence this is slowing down really for Italy or Europe. And so that's not good news for us right now either.
Got it. And then what do you take in terms of China? I think today we're recording on Thursday, March 19th. It was either yesterday or today they reported no new cases. So, quote unquote, 0 new cases. Can we trust the data? How do you kind of fit that data point into this whole thing?
So I'm in contact with people that have come back from China, and they feel convinced that China has it under control and that data is real. That's always been the question, though, is from the very beginning. China didn't really want to announce that this was the virus. You had the whistleblowers that were originally persecuted and now praised. And so there is always this distrust of the information from China. But South Korea has kind of very positive results. I think Singapore has been doing a good job controlling this. And so it's possible. It's also possible on the kind of social infrastructure side of things. I think in China and South Korea, the social distancing is maybe a lot easier, or if the government recommends it or imposes it, it's done much more effectively. Whereas in Italy and the US, a lot of people are like, well, screw that. I'm going to go kiss whoever's cheek I want. I'm going to go to the bars. And so I think that it really takes a little bit more to scare people. And now people are starting to get scared, where maybe they're scaling back on that a little bit. But if you read a lot of the Italians, what they're telling Americans right now is do that now. Don't wait until it gets so bad that there's a curfew. If you're outside, like in Italy right now, if you go outside, you have to essentially have a pass or a very good evidence of a reason for being out. Otherwise, you get fined. And the only reason you're really allowed to go out is to go to pick up medication or to go to grocery stores.
Yeah. The other thing I just saw literally right before we started recording, and again, so I'll caveat with I haven't had the time to look at the accuracy of it, is Israel is actually implementing martial law. Actual true martial law, where the government or the military is going to enforce people staying inside, curfews, all of this kind of non-essential traffic, et cetera. And so I think that we're probably far away from that, in the US, for example, or other places. But, depending on people's reactions, I think that, there is this overarching feeling of like, we've got to flatten that curve and kind of fight back against this.
I would say there's a non-zero chance some version of martial law comes to the U.S. as well in the next 2-3 weeks. I mean, if this thing continues to spread and people aren't voluntarily kind of isolating themselves, then it's definitely possible. It wouldn't surprise me in the next 2 or 3 weeks, which sounds crazy for Americans, especially because a lot of Americans have guns. So it's a little bit of a different.
Well, I was explaining to somebody the other day, if you would have said 4 or 5 weeks ago, hey, the stock market's going to go down 30%, there's the possibility of martial law, all these different things, people would have looked at you like you were nuts. And in a very short period of time, here we are.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that people could be in for a little bit more surprises in the next couple of weeks.
Yeah, well, let's all hope not, and hopefully we can get this thing under control and kind of get back to normal life. Absolutely.
Yep.
Well, James, listen, I really appreciate you coming on such short notice and helping us understand this. Where can people find you online and kind of find more about what you're tracking and paying attention to?
James Todaro MD is my Twitter account. It looks like Joe just put it on the screen there. That's the best way to follow.
Joe's a legend. Look at him, man.
I know, he's quick. That's where I talk about coronavirus updates. A lot of times it's effect on the Bitcoin cryptocurrency markets, and that's where I talk about all my crypto insights as well.
Awesome. Before I let you go, I got 2 questions that you get to ask me one. Favorite book or most important book you've ever read?
Most important book I ever read? Gosh. I guess Treasure Island. For no real reason except it was a book that it was probably the first very sophisticated book that my dad read to me. He read it to me when I was very, very young, and it was actually funny because I felt like he was too slow. So after he read the first maybe a few chapters of it, I actually just picked it up and read the rest of the book on my own, and so that really stands out in my mind.
I love that. It's one of those things where it's not only the book, but the time of your life when you read it that makes something important.
Exactly.
So that's pretty cool.
Exactly.
Aliens, believer or non-believer?
I think there is life somewhere out there in another universe in some way. It doesn't I think that's definitely possible.
Just because the world's so, kind of the galaxy's so big, or some other reason?
I mean, with infinity, you have an infinite number of possibilities, right? So you can have an infinite combinations of matter that can form humans or people or animals or life.
It's a fair way to view the world. What one question do you have for me to finish up?
Does anyone ever call you Anthony, or is it always Pomp?
So my mother still calls me Anthony.
Okay.
And my family, they actually all call me AJ. My initial Anthony John Pompliano is my name, so they call me initials for first and middle name. But pretty much today, if somebody calls me Anthony, it's usually followed up with, by the way, can I call you Pomp, or are we not like close enough yet? And I tell people that you can call me whatever you want, just don't call me an asshole, and we'll be good. So Anthony, Pomp, whatever, it all works for me.
All right, man. Well, it was great talking to you. Thanks for having me on the show.
Yeah, thanks so much, James. Appreciate it.
All right, have a good one.